Well, ladies and gentlemen, I have the pleasure of speaking with the one and only Andrew Luber. Andrew Luber is doing extremely important work in the relations of, say, philosophy with the arts. You know, I'm a big fan of the phenomenology of the artist. I think that's really important. But Mr. Luber has done just a marvelous document that has very important thinking in it on story and theme, how they relate, what are the differences, what are some of the mistaken impressions that people have of story today, how these things can relate to thinking of ourselves in the world and as kind of being trying to understand the world and ourselves in it. And I always love it when Andrew shows up at the net. I always love the conversations that we have, and I'm really, I've had a chance to speak to him on a number of occasions, and I always learn a lot, and I always enjoy it, and I love the way he articulates his ideas and brings his thinking forth to other people to help create, to use a word that I love that he'll talk about, a clearing that we can sort of dwell in together. And Mr. Luber always does a wonderful job at creating those shared clearings. So Andrew, thank you for being here today. It's a delight.
Thank you, Daniel. You're amazing. Thank you for the opportunity, and I'm excited to talk. This is gonna be great.
I look forward to it, Andrew. I look forward to it. Well, first off, Andrew, where do you live? What do you do? Questions like that I'll throw at you.
So I'm from Philadelphia. I wanted to wear some kind of
Nice.
I'm from Philly. I live in LA now. I'm a screenwriter. I have a writing partner. His name's Alex, and basically, I just spend my days writing and doing like side gigs or stage managing or little things here and there, but I read and write. That's basically what I do.
Well,
Yeah.
you are a man after my own heart. Michelle lived in Philadelphia, so I'm quite familiar with driving up to Philadelphia very often in different things. And the real world takes me back to 11 p.m. MTV in the 90s. So I appreciate that, Andrew. Now, Andrew, one of the distinctions you make in your work is the difference between the storyteller without a hyphen and the storyteller with a hyphen. And so that would be the first. What do you mean by that difference? Why do you think that difference was needed? And another question that can be asked is why did you even say feel the need to write the document that you did or to do the work that you did? So you can take either of those questions in any order you like, but those are two that I would be curious to hear your response to.
To answer the latter one first, I honestly feel responsible because I had an insight on the entertainment industry when I moved out here that made me think that we're living in some form of meaning crisis. And this was about 4 years ago. And I couldn't really articulate it at the time then, but everything that I was watching and all the focus that the entertainment industry is in is on meaningless content. And I was thinking basically the reason why I'm not able to like see meaning in the world, or that other people see meaning in the world or think that, is because people, when they're bored, they go to the entertainment that the entertainment industry puts out. And if they just consume meaningless content, then their feedback loop, that self-referencing feedback loop, will, in my mind, be like poisoned a little bit. The well will be poisoned a little bit. It's like if you clear the water in the well, then when you drink it, you're going to be healthy. You're going to see meaning in the world. So that was basically, and to tie it into the first question, that's the main distinction. It's a storyteller with a hyphen basically is telling a story from its ontological roots, from a place where it's evoking meaning itself. So where a storyteller without the hyphen is more thinking about it from an appetitive standpoint, thinking about it from a desire and a likeness standpoint. They're thinking about the other viewer. So like a big misconception in the industry is, what is my audience going to like? Like thinking about the primary thought in the thinking process of creating something starts with what someone else is going to like. To me, that's very presumptuous. First of all, like there's no way you're going to ever know what someone else likes. So like, why come from a place where you won't even have why come from a place of no knowledge? Come from a place of knowing. Come from some ground. So in my mind, the storyteller comes up with its ground. It clears a path. So like to go to like our previous conversation with like thinking, like what philosophy, my take is just philosophy is a clearing in the sense that a philosopher thinks a new way of looking at the at life. And when you arrive at a new way of looking at life, you're able to come out of that new way of looking at life and live a life, so to speak. So to me, with art, you need to clear a way for why that art is existing in the first place. Why does it need to exist? Like, when I look at a TV screen, when I looked at a movie screen, it's like, why isn't there static shock? Like, why isn't it just static? Like, there's a reason why it's not just static on the TV. Like NBC, if meaning didn't matter, all they would put up is just static, and they would be making money. So obviously, meaning means something in the equation. Like there's a point in which static becomes not static, and then there's a point where not only that static does not become static anymore, it's picked by preference what exactly it's gonna be. So it's like there's these layers to what actually ends up on the television screen, and people are not starting at the primordial place. People are not starting at the true center point. So that's where the distinction between a storyteller with a hyphen and a storyteller come from. Storyteller with a hyphen, they basically clear their own ground and stand on that ground, creating the artwork.
Well, that was magnificent. So a few things. I really, really appreciate everything you just said. One time I was sitting in a class. It was an English class. I did a lot of literature. And the professor said something along the following. I think it was the poetry of William Blake is what it was. It was a romantic class that they were doing in Transcendentalists. So you had William Blake, you had Lord Byron, Shelley, all of these. And I remember the teacher said something like, and the reason he was talking, he said something like, and the reason we're all here is for pleasure. The reason we read poetry is to have a good time and to enjoy it. And I remember thinking, having the worst taste in my mouth. I meant, oh my gosh, no, it cannot be about mere pleasure. I mean, William Blake, like I would be, and it to me, the juxtaposition was so pronounced precisely because these particular poets, Lord Byron, Shelley, Blake, if you would have said, hey, William Blake, poetry is about pleasure, he would have thrown an inkwell across the room to hit you like Luther throwing it at Satan in that old story or something like that. Because there is no way that William Blake sat down to write the Marriage of Heaven and Hell and went, man, you know what? This is going to be something that's going to make people feel warm and fuzzy inside. No, for William Blake, there is some sort of ontological stakes, some sort of ontological ground that people are missing, that he found only in this particular form of poetry, very dense, very difficult poetry, that someone like Northam Fry has to spend his entire life trying to decipher because it's so difficult, that this created some sort of not merely emotional, but also mental, full body, full spiritual experience that took you out of your shelves and shook you awake. Because, he's seeing the Industrial Revolution, he's seeing all of these transformations of Europe, and he feels like Europe is becoming something and losing something, and he doesn't want it to lose that something. And you mentioned, I know we talk a lot about Heidegger. There's something actually very Heideggerian about some of these different thinkers' concerns on maintaining a certain ground that is being lost by the ways that Europe are changing. And yet the way that literature was presented was about being about pleasure. And again, don't even get me started on like Prometheus Unbound by Shelley or some of the works of it. It's just remarkable. Does one really say, you know what, guys? I know what's going to make people feel good inside. I'm going to tell them about Ozymandias and the low and level sands and the King of Kings look upon my works and tremble. And then you see that it's just dust and everything's been reduced to ash. Yeah, that makes me feel real nice and fuzzy inside, boys and girls.
Right.
You know, Shelley, you know, it's like people need to understand. You see right there in Ozymandias, for example, a poem that is saying to you, your understanding of time matters. The ground that you're standing on, the clearing that you occupy, and think about time matters. And you think, oh, you think that power is going to keep you from being, at the end of the day, destroyed by time? You think that money, power, and being the king of kings? Nah, time is going to win at the end of the day. So you better get that straight. This is not pleasure. This is about having a certain understanding about how the world works and, you know, and what is the nature of this world, if you will. So to reduce, so for me, that was always just to kind of share, you know, like you're saying, that story, that sense that something is off. I remember that vividly. You can't tell me, you know, that David Foster Wallace has one of his, I actually always liked Wallace's essays. Consider the Lobster his tremendous collection. He has one on Kafka that's amazing. Simba is amazing. But there's also one on Dostoevsky. And if you think that Dostoevsky, just read about Dostoevsky's life. And if you think that you can say that his work, after reading his life, is an expression of pleasure or creating things that are nice to read, you've lost your mind, basically. I mean, Dostoevsky sees his works. The Brothers Karamazov is a screaming declaration that the 20th century better figure out real quick what ground it wants to stand on, because it's got four Karamazov brothers it's got to choose between, and the one it chooses is going to be a big deal, and it doesn't even realize it needs to make the choice between, you know, Dmitri, Alyosha, Ivan, and the other one is Samarkov, who's kind of the Joker figure in different things, but more can be said. So what you see, my point is that classically, it's very hard for me to see these people as viewing their work as not having deep ontological stakes. I like to talk about ontological stakes. Right. But then, of course, you know, and being in the literary world, you would read, and then I'll give it back to you. You'd read, say, we get a lot of the Plowshares magazines, the Virginia Quarterly Review, Michigan Quarterly, a lot of the literary magazines. And they're not always, but very often a lack of ontological stakes. You know, the story is pleasure, or the story is very beautifully written. It's very beautifully written, but it's gorgeous, but it's done. There's no ontological stakes. And there is something, you sense something is off, something is not right. And that you also sense that there will be consequences for this, this is going to be consequential. So I appreciate what you've been saying, because in the literary world, that has been something that I felt, Michelle and I will talk about, you know, when we would sit in Eunoia, something, basically one of the big hopes of Eunoia, that creative art community that we did, was precisely to make a place where there was creative art that had stakes, that was not just falling into sort of an empty kind of just entertainment. Not that entertainment is bad, but entertainment has to be a piece in the recipe. You know, it can't be the whole.
Primordial. It's just it's down the line a little bit. Like, to me, what you said about pleasure, I can relate to so much, because if the entertainment industry creates things from a place of pleasure, they're not going to be able to get someone to relate to it in a way where they'll be able to self-reference themselves to themselves. Like, it just won't be able to, that immersion won't happen. It's like almost a taste of that immersion happens, and then it like detaches, leaving you more. Like, to me, like, that's why TikTok, like, it makes me think of TikTok. Just like you get like a slight taste at best, and then it's so accessible to do that again. It scrolls right up. So yeah, I just think it's the pleasure point from a different angle, very relatable.
Oh yeah. Well, and it makes me think, like Bernard and I, you know, that Bernard and I would talk about this. It's when there should always be an awareness of the quote unquote ground that your art is pointing to or that is in the background of it, because if not, here's the thing, if you don't believe art has anything to do with meaning, well, then a kind of meaninglessness is in the background of your art. And that is what there is still going to be a philosophical background. It's just going to be one that is more nihilistic. And worse yet, you're going to entertain people into it. It's almost like a trap that has a really nice candy and you walked in and it shuts its mouth on you or something like that. And so you as the artist must own the fact that you are putting forth a ground. Now, the danger, of course, is it's very difficult, say, to have a ground and to not, say, turn your work into something polemic or where you're just kind of pouring in from the top your message. But you have to be aware that you cannot avoid a ground. You cannot avoid putting forth, say, a worldview or things like this. And this is where, for me, I find really interesting, and you mentioned this at the beginning of your look, this relationship between story and philosophy. How there's something about where most philosophers in Western history have actually been storytellers. They have not really been philosophy because you can't really do pure philosophy, if you will. And Samuel Barnes will actually talk about that. So if I were to ask you, and like the differences between story and philosophy, why you think story is a helpful concept for rethinking the history of philosophy or what philosophy is doing as opposed to what story is doing. How would you respond to that? Just an open question.
So to me, I feel like I'm echoing Heidegger here. I feel like I'm very much piggybacking off of Heidegger, where to keep with the scenario, the ground, the clearing scenario, most philosophy has just been the ability to show a standing on a ground. Most philosophy does not talk about actual clearing and getting to a place where you meet, in my mind, Dasein, and Dasein, in Dasein, you stand, you arise. So to me, most philosophy literally just gets to the arising point, a possible arising. So what's unique about Heidegger is Dasein in this hypothetical here is only the point in which a standing occurs. So it's the ground of ground in the sense that it is the point in which a possible standing can occur. So I could even make a claim that Heidegger didn't even do pure philosophy in the sense that he did it. Let me backtrack for a second. He did a clearing. He obviously thought to a point where he realized that most people just talked about risings and not the point in which something actually can be a rise or standing. The thing that he pointed out in my mind is like, can we ever know if we've actually done a genuine clearing in the sense that it's possible that he just walked a path that other people created and just realized like, oh, like some of the clearing actually grew back. Let me just cut it real quick. So that's what's really unique about Heidegger. It's did it grow back or did he actually clear his own path? And I think that's a very interesting question, which Nishitani really brings out, honestly, a little bit. And hopefully my aim, and I lost your question. I forgot your question, but my aim is that to create a means of accessing the clearing in a Heidegger authentic sense, where it's like you can be, I don't want to say certain, but you can feel confident that you have cleared a path and created a possibility of standing. So you realize Dyson, you're in Dasein. Like, I'm talking conceptually at this point. Like, once you make that realization and that process leading up to that realization, and the ability to actually stand within that realization, then I feel like it becomes like the real game has begun, the real like science. Because to me, the real science, if there is real science and not storytelling, the way I'm talking about it, it's in that clearing. It's in that initial phase, way before we even are in Dasein. And that's where I'm at in my work, I would say, that question.
Well, I think the language of story and philosophy can even help you ask the question. It's very difficult to answer questions that are not asked well, or that are asked in a way that is difficult to put your finger on. And there is this kind of idea that if philosophy, so you have this mistake, it seems, where story doesn't acknowledge that there is a ground from which it's operating from, or entertainment, or what you have. But you also have this other problem where philosophy seems to suggest that it is possible for it to operate without referring to a story, that it is always already being situated within. And you see, so it seems like what's so weird, and you mentioned this, is that philosophy and story are like twins, right? They're like twin sisters, I think. They're like really similar, and yet they're not the same. And one of the ways, it's you know, if I'm thinking about Mr. Barnes' question, his book, The Iconoclast, because I really like Mr. Barnes' book. You know, he makes a point where you say you can always have a philosophy of basically anything, right? You can have a philosophy of technology, a philosophy of humans, philosophy of science, philosophy of philosophy, you know, so on and so on and so on. And so there's this character of philosophy that allows it to be about anything, right? Which is kind of unique, because you can't really have, say, a science of everything in the same way that you can have a philosophy of everything. But it seems to be really difficult to have what he'll talk about is a philosophy of philosophy, because then that's what he calls the meta question, which would be pure philosophy, which would be philosophy that entails no presuppositions, no axioms, no givenness at all, where you're just taking on raw philosophy.
Here's my thing with that. A pure philosophy, to me, the way pure philosophy in that sense, it's like you're still not answering if you're the one clearing or not. Like that to me is a separate, like that to me isn't addressed by that question. So it's like, sorry, go ahead.
Well, oh no, that's very good. And this is where you see, if philosophy to itself cannot provide its own grounding, then ultimately, because a lot of his work's going to be on David Hume, who I'm obsessed with as well, it has to refer back to a common life and has to be situated in a common life, which is the question of who is telling, who is asking the meta question. And really for David Hume, because I see a lot of, well, I see Hume everywhere because I'm biased, but I see a lot of what you're warning about and what also Heidegger warns about, because I actually kind of think that Heidegger's thinking, funny enough, aligns a lot with the Scottish Enlightenment. I actually tried to write a piece called is Heidegger, you know, part of the Scottish Enlightenment? Kind of funny enough, because in the Scottish Enlightenment, especially like a David Hume, there's a notion that when philosophy tries to be its own grounding without reference to who is trying to make philosophy its own grounding, then it becomes a force of destruction. It becomes something that devours everything and totalizing. Like if you don't ask the question, who's doing the clearing, then you end up being cleared away, actually, by this, you know, you get wounded away. And so what's interesting is that, you know, so they see like the language that Hume uses is kind of common life. And to me, I associate the common life with what you talk about with the storyteller as the hyphen. As opposed to the storyteller without the hyphen. There is something about the storyteller with the hyphen that then is going to bring in Heidegger that actually can be linked up into the common life. Now David Hume obviously does not talk about Dasein, but he's going to talk about sentiment, habit, and I think he lacks, and I mentioned this with Philippe, he lacks returning to the universal or returning to some philosophical inquiries that I think we need Heidegger and Hegel, because I'll mention Hegel a lot, that is lacking. But the reason why it does seem as if story, and then I'll give it back to you, maybe, and I think you're making the case for why it does, why a reason why I appreciate your work so much, is another reason why it always strikes me that story might have something to do with the question of how properly to approach, use, think about philosophy might have something to do with story, is because in the same way you can have a philosophy of everything, you can have a story of everything. You can have a story of science. You can have a story of philosophy, a story of humanity, a story of story. Like both philosophy and story are unique and thus twins. You know, you mentioned
Right.
it, they're twins in their ability to always be about something. And
Right.
yet, what's interesting to me is that the way they're about something, about anything, does not seem identical. The way a philosophy of technology would unfold does not seem to be the same as the way a story of technology would unfold. And yet, both of them have this very unique meta characteristic of possibly being about any variable. And that has always struck me, that there's stuff going on there, some sort of
Yeah.
relation possibly. And then if we think of story, common life, you know, if we link those together, things kind of go together. So that's always been something, and I'll give it back to you. That's always been something that's interested in me, is this ability for both of them to do that, thus suggesting there may be something going on between them.
Right. Your clearing comment reminded me of what Michelle posted on your Instagram page with the waiter like walking away. You're now the waiter. I thought that was so funny. But anyway, yeah, I think so. What I think Heidegger's missing, if we're so you David Hume's missing a little bit of Heidegger.
Yeah,
Okay,
everyone's
what's
missing
Heidegger?
something. Yeah.
Exactly. What I think we're at a very interesting point because I think Nishitani kind of is. I can already tell how he's going to attack Heidegger. Like, if he is explicitly going to attack Heidegger, it's basically what I've been saying to you about the lack of emanation. Like, the religion is the way he's coming at it is essentially how I see it with the clearing scenario here is that is the clearing mechanism, like allows you to then be in Dasein to then arise out of Dasein with your content, so to speak. So to me, there's this quote. Let me just so I wrote theme in all caps next to this.
Nice.
This really yeah, I'll read. Far from being the one and only way of bringing out into the open the evident fact of the cogito. Now he's at this point talking about Descartes. He's introducing um, evident of the cogito. It is no more than one possible way of looking at that fact, one philosophical position among others. Specifically, it is the expression of one particular mode of being of the age, namely the self-centered mode of being. So not only does he point out how the philosophy in itself is just the possibility, i.e., a story, he names the story. He names its origin right away in such a clear way, but so deep. It's like, because you really have to put that together. He literally, how did it get there? How did it clear its way? The self-centered way.
Right.
So to me, I haven't read much further. I'm on 19. So I'm very new to Nishitani. But to me, he is setting up, and I totally see how John Vervaeke is like piggybacking off of him. Absolutely. But he's setting up the dictionary for the I guess the naming, the data pointing of the clearing. Yeah, I mean, the whole paragraph's fantastic, but that's really that part was very, to me, thematic, just in the sense of pointing out how it's a possibility and tracing back that possibility's origins with a possible like label of that, like, yeah.
Oh, well, it's, you know, the language of theme is something else that you do such a good job in your text of describing and comparing that with story and theme. And I really appreciate that. And I think you definitely see in this Ashanti, whose name I can never say because I'm just a simple country boy, is that there is an awareness of, you are picking a road, you are picking a way, the ego way. But the issue is the moment you pick it and you live according to that story, it necessarily presents itself not as a way, but the way. And so then you lose sight of the relationship of situating yourself in a story as you're engaging in philosophy. And then, of course, the problem is when you do that, then you're going to probably be a storyteller without the hyphen as opposed to a storyteller with the hyphen. Whereas when you have the awareness of this distinction in the way, well, then what you end up doing is going, wait a minute, I cannot have a conclusion and then go. I have to, and that's what ends up happening. He's describing with Descartes. You're saying, oh, okay, I think, therefore I am. And then with that, I will tell my story. Well, that's pouring in from the top, right? That's the problematic thing that we say, as opposed to saying, no. And you talk about this in your text, it's so good, is the theme is what is worked out in the story. Like the theme is integrated in the entire whole. And that is the, dare I say, new philosophy, or a different, that's always a dangerous term, but that's the kind of like, wait, no. Story theme is worked out in the story. You have another part, and it made me think of this. You say something in your text along the lines of theme is what people think come in conclusion, like after you finish a story, then you determine what the theme is. The problem there is it seems as if people are conflating theme and moral. Like they'll say, oh, the moral of the story is X, or the point of the story is Y. And they'll say, therefore, the theme is Z or something. You see, people are using theme as a simile for moral or point, or meaning, but meaning not in kind of the like dictionary, like fill in the test meaning kind of thing. And as a result, we have a very impoverished understanding of theme, and we don't understand theme as something we live, as opposed to something we retrospectively add. And what Nishanti is pointing out, because he has at one point at the beginning, and we talked about this in the Philosophy of Glimpses, where he's talking about that scene in Dostoevsky where he's watching the farm girl in the farm, and Nishanti basically says something like, very rarely do we actually look at anything. Like very, very rarely do we actually see anything. We think we do, but we really don't. And right there, what he's pointing to is that the kind of philosophy that we need to be doing is one that really, really, dare I say, looks, pay attention, sees what's there, because that kind of level of attention is a clearing making. Like when you really, really see the farm girl, like he makes that reference of Dostoevsky. I think it's Poorhouse. No, that's Dickens. Anyway, he makes that real example of, no, that's Bleak Out is Poorhouse. I think I'm getting there. Poor focus, I think. Is that like seeing, like really, really seeing, what I would associate with care, is how you get a clearing. And in that kind of clearing, then when you are participating and living the theme, you can contribute to the clearing if anything has grown up in it. You can live in the clearing and keep it cleared. There seems to be like a double action that you're trying to do. You can like enter into a clearing and you can keep it cleared and have the story emerge into the theme. And that seems to be what, and I'll give it back to you, what Nishanti, he understands so well, and he's trying to bring out, as opposed to this tendency in philosophy to say, oh, this is the theme, now let's tell stories according to that theme, ergo Western philosophy, ergo the cognito, ergo whatever philosophical stew you want, as opposed to going, no, let's actually live a story that really pays attention, that's really aware, that's really phenomenologically engaged, would be kind of the terminology I want to use, or would tend to use, of which then the theme can be in that can come out, as opposed to us pouring in from the top, if you will.
Right. No, that was fantastic. That's what I was telling you about. I feel like you just said it so much better than me.
You're very kind. You're very kind.
No, that was great. There's different lenses in which to look at these terms here. So to me, there's like, if we were to look at an existential lens, that to me would be like how to create artwork, science, like tangible things that from a thought that can be turned into some form of real actual thing. So that's what I mean by existential lens. So if we were to look at the existential lens here, to me, the difference between theme and story is that theme transcends the existential lens.
Mm.
Like the story only exists within that existential lens. So then where does theme also exist if not in the existential lens? It does exist in the existential lens, but it's like a bridge. Like I like to think of it as a bridge. It has an embodiment in the existential lens, but it also has one in the ontological lens. And what I mean by that is um, theme also is directly in Dasein.
Mm.
So like Dasein obviously is in the actual existential lens. It's part of experience, but its roots trace back prior to experience in a sense. And that's where like the theme comes into play here. So it's like I have these I posit something, it's like a well thought out posit, and I take that posit and run with it I run with it in terms of the story. I run with it in the story. So the story hasn't started yet because though Dasein is in the story at that point, it's also not in the story in the sense that it's the preconditions that make up the story as well.
Mm.
So like that's where the theme also exists in that preconditional realm. So then to take another step back, so to speak, all I've discussed is when you're at a ground and you're able to arise and stand on a ground. That's all theme and stories. That's what the ontological lens is to me.
Mm.
Is the point in which you're able to stand on a ground.
Mm.
So then this is what to me would be like pure philosophy. This is like I'm not really sure. Like maybe it's wrong for me to call it not the ontological lens, but the clearing, like I might be repeating myself here, but the clearing prior to arriving at that ground in which you're able to stand on, there's a whole movement, there's a whole towardness about it. There's a whole way of going about it. And to me, that's thema.
Mm.
So there's thema, theme, story.
Mm.
So to me, when you're an artist, you have to have so like kind of to answer the question that I posed earlier, which is how do you know if you're just like recutting already cut leaves to create a ground for you to stand on?
Right.
To me, you can only be confident in the story in which it brought you there.
Mm.
So it's like the individual, like what's funny to me is like the most unique, like uniqueness is the most common trait amongst people.
Mm.
Everybody is unique, and that's what makes us so common. And
Right. Right.
we just need to embrace our unique way of approaching a clearing,
Mm.
and therefore we will just be confident that it is our own clearing, and therefore that to me is like Hegel. It talks a little bit of the sensational. There's a confidence, there's a feeling, there's a mood that you have to embrace in order for you to get there.
Mm.
And that mood has to be active enough to a
Mm.
significant degree in
Mm.
order for you to get to the place in which you can be in Dasein and stand or arise rather.
Mm.
So that's what I mean by there's theme, because theme only exists in Dasein.
Right.
So to me, when Heidegger talks about unthematic things, he has to be referring to the thema realm,
Mm.
just like ontologically prior to Dasein. But I feel like he wouldn't agree with that.
Mm.
That's where it's like I would want to talk to a true expert. Like, yes, I feel very comfortable to talk about Heidegger in every which way, but like this to me is like on the edge of like Heideggerian thinking, like on whether he would agree that there's a pre-ontological phase to Dasein.
I think that's a very fascinating question. I will posit a possible way to think about it that might be entirely wrong, and if it is wrong, we will cut it from the recording. No, I'm joking, but we will. So something that comes to mind is there's a short story. I'll use a literary example. There's a short story called Greenleaf by Flannery O'Connor. And I think it's a magnificent story. And if anyone doesn't want the ending ruined, you should skip this. The rest of the conversation may not make sense, but you know, you'll have a great, go read the story, actually. It's a masterpiece. Okay. And in this story, there's this lady who I think Miss May or something, and she's not very nice, and she's kind of closed in, and she's kind of self-centered. She's kind of closed in on herself. And the story ends basically with a bull impaling her. She gets impaled by a bull. Okay. Now I have not actually, what's interesting, so you know the kind of the story now, right? So if I were to ask you, what do you think the story's about? It's kind of be weird. Be like, well, I guess it's a lady getting, you know, what's due to her, right? She's kind of closed in. She's kind of a jerk. So maybe she got impaled by the bull or different things like that. Well, actually, if the theme, what is the theme of the story, would be the operations of God's grace. And the issue is that when sin, because Flannery O'Connor is a Catholic and she's writing as a Christian, and her theme would be the idea that grace has to be violent when you have someone that's closed off. Like if you have someone that's totally deprived and they're not open to love, well, the only way to save them from their state of total depravity is actually a form of violence. So what Flannery O'Connor is putting forth is actually the idea that there are situations where God's love has to manifest through violence. Oh, well, that's a very different idea than what you may have just gotten from the mere facts of the story that I gave you, right? So you would have to, so how would you arise, though, at the theme of the story? Well, right. You would have to know Flannery O'Connor's background. You'd have to read the story closely. You would have to look at the details. And actually, there are details of the story to make it clear. She makes very subtle allusions to Miss May looks at the sun. There's a Dante allusion there. There's the bull is tied to Zeus. Actually, it's a kind of god coming from. It's a kind of monster. And so God's using a kind of demon to wake someone up. And then the horn hugs Miss May, I believe, as like God's embrace or different things like that. So there's details in the story that would suggest the theme.
Right.
But that theme, though, only makes sense within a thema of Christianity, like a larger metaphysics that believes God exists, right? So right. God exists as the thema, and the God is the Trinity. Therefore, it's possibility of having a theme where grace is violence, and the story is Miss May gets impaled by a bull. Right? Now, what's very interesting is you can't actually necessarily get to the theme from the mere facts of the story. This is where it becomes very mysterious to me. Like, how would you learn? If you didn't know Flannery O'Connor was a Catholic, right? Mm-hmm. Could you ever figure out that that's what the story is about? This is something I think about a lot. And
okay, that's a great...
And so this is where it's very fascinating, because does the pure story per se allow a unveiling of the theme? And this also then I think ties to your last question. Is thema Flannery O'Connor's opinion? This is where it's weird, right? Because this is where it blurs in Heidegger. I think you're getting at this very well. Like you're suggesting, like thema for Flannery O'Connor, Christianity transcends her. It's not subjective. It's not her mere standing. It is objective reality. But to someone who's not a Christian, they would say that, no, it's not the case, right? That's not actually, right. That is just Flannery. That's just an expression of Flannery O'Connor's standing. So this is what's weird, is that thema, for the person operating according to thema, it's not merely their standing, right? It's actually something transcendent of them. But that's only to them, right? So this is where I think the dilemma emerges, where thema to the subject, if you'll grant me that language, to Flannery O'Connor is not the same as theme, but to someone who's not Flannery O'Connor, it may be the same as theme, or it may overlap in pretty profound ways. You see what I'm saying? And Absolutely. So this is where the debate, I think, arises. And I think Greenleaf as a kind of skeleton to approach the question can be useful, because then it's also interesting. Like, it's basically impossible now for me personally to read Greenleaf and to almost be able to tell if I could arrive at the theme and then the
Right.
thema, which I would get to the thema from the theme if I would arise that from the pure story. Heidegger may say something like, no, you can't arrive. The pure story and the theme are so integrated together that it almost becomes inseparable. But precisely because they're inseparable, it's difficult to get to one from the other or the other from the one. And so then in what sense are they divisible? Or if they're only divisible retrospectively? This is, to me, where all of those questions become very fascinating and like the debate may hinge on.
That was great. I think that's a fantastic question. Me and Alex, my writing partner, have talked about that a ton for a very long time now. So I feel pretty confident in my answer for that.
Nice. Boy did his homework.
Yeah, I really did. I really did. Okay, so how you recognize the theme in the story itself is the fact that you're able to keep relating to it. So in that sense, you can't know what. So to me, how I say, like, a theme is a sentence, and I can elaborate on that very much so in a second, but you can't actually know the sentence. But again, words that you use, you can be confident. You can't have certainty, but you can be confident.
Right.
You can be confident in what that sentence is or what the theme is. You can never know because it's not coming from your own thema, like you pointed out, basically. But the only way you can know that it actually hits the theme to a significant degree also, and this kind of is like a little depressing, but like, you watch a movie throughout your life and you keep finding new relations to it until you die. And if you're able to keep finding new relations to it, then there's like true ontological stakes in your language. You should be able to look at a movie like you look at yourself, and it should be inexhaustible. Like, I'm not saying a movie is a person or that it's self-autonomous, but what I'm saying is it mirrors our situation so perfectly that when we reflect on our situation, we will keep getting new takes. And to put it in the Heidegger terms, it's like, when we go into a movie theater, we're bringing our being in the world into that, like, relationship, so to speak. The world is the movie theater, in that, like, dynamic. But like, before we even get into that dynamic, we are bringing our own self into the situation, and that has its own meaning in the world outside of the movie theater. So to me, when you actually sit in the movie theater, your world, your meaning that you bring into the equation here will always change. And if this thing that is constant, it's a constant because it has no relation to the world, but just to the viewer in which it has a relation to the world. So when you're watching a movie, then at that point, you constantly should be bringing your thoughts to that movie into your new world paradigm, because your world paradigm should be changing throughout your life, and it should be able to relate to each new paradigm that you encounter. And that, to me, is like the hallmark of good art. So you can never, and it's like a trap. It's like, is something good art? Sure. Well, then you need to die, because that needs to be the last time you've seen it. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like, I guess I'm like taking into account like a consequentialist viewpoint a little bit, where it's just like, well, it's good until it's not, until there's like the next time, until the next time. It all depends on the next time a little bit, because and my I would venture to say that if you've watched something and it's good, you watch it for 10 years and it's good, you're gonna be able to keep watching it and it'd be good to you. Like it's not gonna, and that's speculation, but yeah, it's just that to me is the hallmark. It's the ability to self-reference yourself. Like when I wrote The Orange, like, and there's a whole TV show basically that we wrote with like a bunch of shorts. It's called Coexist, and like we're we're pitching it right now, but each episode is supposed to give you a new access point for self-referencing. That's literally the whole point of it. So like I sent you the entertainers, and like to me that comes from a pure music perspective, where it's like it seems like not everyone in the music process is valued properly. Like there's so many things that go into the music process where people don't even know. They don't see certain players that are key roles in the process. How do you, if you're in the process, existentially satisfy yourself knowing that a little bit? Well, here's how a little bit. That to me is like where the entertainers come from. And I don't know if you read it or not, but it's just basically bass and treble. Bass is jealous of treble, and like they go back and forth, and I won't give away the whole story, but yeah.
No, but both of those pieces, one, well done on pitching that and putting it together. I wish you the best in that. That is not easy work, so I salute you. Second, the and I love the orange was, I really love the storyboards that you shared. And I love well, what's so interesting with those two characters, without giving any of it away, by setting it up where one can see and the other but can't hear, and the other can hear but cannot see, that right there creates kind of ontological stakes in that tension. One, it creates a lot of situations that are fun to follow, and then actually creates very subtle ways that you can see problems brewing that are not evident at the time, but are going to come back along. So, for example, if when since eyes cannot hear anything, and here the ears are, say, dancing because they love the music. For eyes, it's like, you're crazy. What are you doing? This is nuts, right? Because you can't hear the music. Where, but eyes has the problem of, say, the orange is so beautiful, it can pull them in, right? Or eyes can see a blemish on orange that ears cannot see. And then when he's splitting the orange and he's deciding who's going to eat what, he knows that ears wouldn't know if it got the food with the blemish, and how that creates a tension. And also, it shows you how the very way you relate to the world and your rationality is organized is according to your thrownness. So if you only have eyes and cannot hear, then you can only possibly understand someone dancing is kind of weird, unless someone explained the concept of dancing to you, right? But like so what, that act of ears dancing is irrational and stupid. Well, no, that's just relative to your thrownness, right? That's just relative to what you're in the reverse. And so right there's ontological significance that, and stakes and theme that I think are part of the story, that are in the story. And that is, I think, well, the reason I also like that language is because, in my opinion, that seems to be the hallmark of great literature. Like in Flannery O'Connor, the theme arises in the unfolding of the story. It is not poured in from the top. She's not giving you, she hated some, it's actually quite funny. Like there were a lot of Catholics that gave her their short stories, and she hated them, even if they were like Christian propaganda. And in the end, Jesus saves everyone. She was like, this is trash, because it's the language that I always use. It's poured in from the top. You're having your Christian metaphysics kind of save the day. It's why, like C.S. Lewis is, in my opinion, the end of the space trilogy is so problematic, because it's basically one giant Deus ex machina. That doesn't quite work. And but what you see is, like, I always go to the example. One of my favorite scenes in literature is Anna Karenina, where Tolstoy has the prince. He goes out into help in the fields, and he's cutting all the hay, and how to me, it's one of the most beautiful things you ever see. And there is an entire way of life, a philosophy of life that comes out of the scene that is not talked about. It's just all that is shown and expressed is the act of taking the scythe and cutting down the hay and going through the fields and having the shadows creep across as the sun sets. And it's all in the story of the scene. It is all
Right.
that kind of arises out of it. And that, and I think great literature generally, that's what it does, is it has that combination come together. Where the problem, so at the beginning, we talked about this kind of sense that you see in literature or in story, in movies and Hollywood and different things. The sense that, the entertainment goes first and then the theme is poured on, or people say what the theme is afterwards. Or in literature, you have the same thing. I think if, for me, it's so clear that that this is a problem when you compare it to quote unquote great literature. And yeah, a lot of people say, oh, it's great to you. Well, no, I don't think it's great to me. Precisely, I love how you put it, because of the relationability. Every time I read Dostoevsky, it is new. It relates to me. It is deepening my own theme in my life. I go back and read the Brothers Karamazov like every 7 years, and Ivan Karamazov is a radically different person from the first time I read to who he is now. Same words on the page, but that is entirely transformed, because it turns out that Ivan has much deeper ontological stakes than I realized, that I could not have realized until I'm the age I am now. Now I am ready to understand that, wait a minute, Ivan Karamazov is the one who said that if God didn't exist, everything would be permitted, not Alyosha, and he's the one who wants to turn his ticket back into God. Wait a minute, he can only be upset at the problem of evil if God exists to allow him to be upset with the problem of evil. Basically, if God didn't exist, then there would be no evil, and Ivan is mad at God because of evil. Well, that would mean the only way he can be mad at God is because there is a God to be mad at. So Ivan Karamazov is a much more complicated character when he comes to realize this, and you start to understand why he's gradually losing his mind, because his very rebuke of God requires there to be a God to allow the standard according to which he rebukes God. That's much more complex than the Ivan of the Grand Inquisitor separated from the rest of the text. And that's an example of relatability that emerges. And then the theme of the brother, here's what's interesting. The true theme of the Brothers Karamazov begins to emerge as it comes out, where what you see is that the very conditions that are needed to critique the modern world are also what makes you want to critique the modern world, that you're kind of trapped in this circular problem, and that this is what Dostoevsky is exploring. Because you can say, well, Dostoevsky is a Christian, right? Oh, the smartest characters in his novels are the ones that disagree with him. He goes all out. He is putting himself through a crucible of doubt. He means this. He doesn't know where he's going to end up. He's not going to pour in his thinking from the top. And so you start seeing that there's a much deeper theme that's coming at play, and not a simplistic thema that's coming to play, because you have the possibility of a God who, in a sense, created something that man cannot bear. You don't have a Christianity where God, for example, is simplistic and he makes everything nice and fluffy. Instead, you have a kind of tragic God that that because God exists, not everything is permitted. But that means that your understanding that things shouldn't be permitted means that a God had to have created a world where things shouldn't be permitted. So that's a much more tragic kind of worldview than some kind of straightforward, simplistic Christianity that you can have. Well, that understanding of the Brothers Karamazov has emerged through time and my relation to the text. And to me, you put it very well when you talk about that relatability to the text being a very strong indication that there actually is a theme that is in the story itself, not poured in from the top. Because if it was poured in from the top, it wouldn't grow. Is how I take it. Is like if you were pouring the theme in from the top, nothing, that would be it. Yeah, it would be done. But the fact that the War and Peace transforms, Anna Karenina transforms. I love Flaubert. I think Simple Heart is a masterpiece. So Simple Heart always changes. And I actually there's a transformation which goes to show that I think indeed the theme is part of the story, that you can find the theme in the story, not merely know the theme and put it on. That transformation is evident that there's something there because it breaks through what you tried to put on it. You see, that's kind of the evidence. It breaks through what you tried to put on it. So that's evidence, I think, to your point that the
You
theme
don't
is there.
understand how happy this makes me. That like that I really feel like we're on the same page. Like when you talk to my writing partner, like 2020 when I really started like seeing theme, like I like in movies and stuff, like I was able to be like, that was very thematic. Like I could tell that's going to grow in like I thought I was crazy. Like I literally thought I was crazy. And I was like looking all over the internet. I'm like, Heidegger and theme, who's talking about this right now? Because he's saying theme, like, but it's not in this way. Kind of like what's going on here? I literally thought I was crazy, and like I only had him and like two other friends to like confide in, really, with about this, and I was just like, oh my god, like it's like such a profound feeling when you watch something that's bad and you're able to really understand why it's bad.
Yes.
Like not just like subjectively, I didn't like it. Like, because there's terrible things that I love. that,
Sure.
like, and I had to come to grips with that. Like, I started realizing, I was like, wait a second, what's up with my taste here?
Right.
Why is my taste kind of shitty? Like this doesn't actually mean anything. Like, it's cool, but that's it. Like I'm infatuated by it, I realize. Um it's funny. It's kind of like when you think you're in love with someone and then it's like, wait, actually I wasn't in love with them because of these whatever, retroactive reasons. But um
Well, first off, I just want to say I'm very glad that we're speaking because I really appreciate as well that the work that you do that is so aware that story, aesthetics, art, theme, that there is something here that needs to be explored and expressed that is very important because basically, like you say, two people. Yeah, I know no one who really, there's like very few people, especially in my older years, there's more as I discover this little corner of the internet of people that appreciate, but like no one has, in my opinion, like literature and philosophy have always been enemies. They've wanted nothing to do. And anyone who tried to say, okay, well, kind of let's explore some of the phenomena. No, go away. And no one wants anything to do with that. And so this topic that we're exploring, the schema that we're just exploring, I don't think has been understood or appreciated. And I think actually, I was thinking about this a little bit. It's almost like, again, like you in your book say that philosophy and story are twins. I wonder if part of it is kind of almost Girardian in the sense of, in Girard, similarity creates conflict. And so, the more similar things are, then the more likely they are to get into a fight because of mimetic desire. And he goes through all of that. It's almost like it's precisely because art and philosophy are so similar, especially when we think of that kind of meta level where you can always have a philosophy of, likewise, it seems like you can always have a story of, that makes them like hate each other. Precisely because of the similarity and like, because I can tell you like what to me also made it very apparent that there was a massive problem is a lot of the, Turn the World, Blackout, and The Stars Were Shining, the short story collection Under the Wing, all of these are what, we had ontological background, dang it, ontological stakes, philosophy, ideas. As soon as they sniff any sort of ideas or philosophy, they're rejecting it. Any of the literary agents, any of them. And I was like, oh, we're doomed. Because any like characters that want to talk about anything that, I don't know, matters, then that's not going to work. And that to me also suggested that you had an industry that was really against the artist taking serious ground. Taking seriously the philosophy that is in the work. Now, I never felt we went to great lengths to make sure that the philosophy was not poured in from the top and that the ideas were part of the story, that the theme and the story work together, not that the theme was poured on top. But the very fact that you had, say, stakes or gravity or heavy, or that the character was taken by trying to understand what choice they should make and how they and like and how also they needed the eyes to be able to tell what choice they should make, as opposed to, say, a relational problem, a family issue, or an identity problem, which were kind of the big things that a lot of the agencies liked. Well, they didn't want anything to do with it. It was too heavy, if you will. It was too heady, and that suggested a massive problem with the industry. So this is all to say that I appreciate your work you're doing, because again, you also, like Michelle and I would have conversations. You'd be like, yeah, and Bernard and I was like, are we crazy? Is this something, are we nuts? Are we, do we think there's something wrong that's really not wrong? And then you really would not have people aware of it. So I appreciate you as well, my friend.
It's a constant fight of, am I crazy or not?
Yes.
Absolutely. I feel you. And then the craziest part to me is basically what I think of a storyteller. It's only like, I'm like trying to develop a new like term. To me, the real science, like I said earlier, is in that actual measuring of the clearing. And that the storytelling is really just arising from Dasein once the clearing's already been done. Is the storyteller's process just stop at Dasein? I have to say yes, because like it's constituted by theme, and theme is in Dasein. So in my mind, there's something else that we need to label contain. Like, to me, it's like the best container, to use Javier's language, is religion in the way Nishitani's talking about it. And that to me is just like, you can replace that with thema as well. Like, but there needs to be a serious focus of the measurement of that, and a look at metaphor usage. But the problem is, like, I don't know, like, when, like, John Vervaeke, I have no idea, like, actually how he does, like, work with other scientists and whatnot. Like, I hear how he talks about it in the few videos that I've seen. But I just wonder if they're coming at it from a storyteller perspective, and then are able to understand the metaphor in that paradigm, versus the potential, what I'm thinking is just the storyteller without the hyphen paradigm. Because to me, like, he's basically going to have general intelligence be able to measure metaphors, but how are they going to do that without understanding a metaphor, right? Like, I don't know what that outcome would be like. Like, I can't even, but like, to me, there's a problem if you're not coming at it from a storyteller perspective.
I think you're asking very important questions. I don't think it is by chance that, there's a lot of this question. Say, Cadell last time would talk about, this notion of the religious layer in the Phenomenology of Spirit with Hegel, where religion is not necessarily institutional religion, but it's this notion of a thema, basically. It's like a people that have a shared thema that then results in themes that have particular manifestations in story, but there's also a thema of which all of these themes / stories are manifesting with and through. And so it is very difficult to have story. It is very clear to me that one of the reasons you have this movement of thinking about literature or art in general as being about pleasure has correlated with the collapse of religion. I don't think that is by chance, because, I made the example of Flannery O'Connor. It's very easy for me to think of stories that make this division between theme, and story that you're describing, and maintain it very well, and actually are successfully great literature in our great literature. But it is much more difficult for me to think of stories that authors are not part of a religious tradition that do the same. I can think of great literature that, like Thomas Pynchon, but even Thomas Pynchon, you got to understand, like Thomas Pynchon and Gravity's Rainbow, The Crying of Lot 49, Mason Dixon. You can talk about Don DeLeo, The Angel.
Let me ask you a quick question.
Sure, yes.
The way I'm thinking about it, at least, like, let's say there's an author that's not religious at all,
Sure.
like not like atheists. Let's say he's
Sure.
an atheist, plenty of those. But they're really, really part of a club that has their own way about life.
Yep.
I would call like you're agreeing with that. So I feel like it's having that that's what Nishtani is meaning by religion, it
Yes.
seems like.
Yes,
I'm early in the text, but
well, and I think Dr. Vervaeke, when he talks about religion without religion, is talking about some sort of
symbolic order that is not reducible to mere subjectivity, but is not also ultimately transcendent. Is that possible? For me, there's a book I started in 2016 that is called Belonging Again, and it's a very long sociological text that basically wants to explore the possibility of a symbolic order, say, after religion, or is it possible after religion? It's going to talk a whole lot about Philip Reeve with The Triumph of the Therapeutic. And this question that's being asked, that you're asking, it's just kind of a sociological question, but not sociological. It's like a philosophical sociological question. Like, is it possible for us to have people that can operate according to themas that have a kind of binding authority on them, like have some sort of claim on them that may not ultimately be transcendent or conscious, say like the Christian God or Allah or different things like that? Or is the very knowing that this capital X variable, if you will, is ultimately created emergently, does that remove its ability to have some sort of ability to organize us? This is a massive sociological question. I think we are discovering it today. And basically my interest in Hegel, getting into topics like absolute knowing, the notion of fundamental lack, these are all questions of, can things like these organize human beings in a manner that makes thema possible, even if it is not in the sense a conscious God or things like this?
So to refer to I forget which net conversation.
Sure.
But
we just call it the net, it's just the net,
Refer to the net. When I made a claim basically that the general intelligence, these learning machines will be our like new gods, if you will.
Sure.
Like what all I mean by that, and I think this ties in perfectly here, is that there's something about the way I look at life, the way you look at life, the way anybody that thinks about thinking looks at life, that allows them, that affords them the ability to think about thinking.
Yes.
So all learning machines are going to do to me, for the human, in terms of the human race, is allow people to get a new way of looking, to allow them to simply be thinking about thinking.
Right.
So at that point, they'll be able to have their own thema and come up with something that stands.
Sure.
Get to the place where something will stand. So to me, that's where GI really comes in handy here. The question to me is, what is it going to do to people that are already thinking about thinking?
Right.
Like, I wonder if ontological design is going to be true, in the sense that it's just going to be, we're our own, like, it's like our ego will be so inflamed where we're our own gods, we create our own universe. Like,
right.
To me, that I feel him, I feel that, like, scary. That's why I'm like a little hesitant to agree, but like, that's to me like where it's leading for the everyday person and for the philosophically inclined individual.
I think you put it very well. So for me, this problem. So if I were to say my own story,
the realization, the seeing of this crisis in the arts, which would be generally what we've described, this lack of, this pouring in of the theme on the story, and this failure to see a division between theme and story. And obviously I did not have that language at the time, or but seeing this kind of crisis in the arts then led to kind of asking questions of, why is there this crisis in the arts? What is going on? And that gets you into the Scottish Enlightenment. It's like, oh, it's philosophy. There's this separation of philosophy from common life, and therefore for the arts, before I forget, David Hume thought that the state of literature was an indication of the health of the culture and the society at large. So that was interesting to discover. So basically what we're saying is like you go into screenwriting and like there's a problem here, which suggests a problem in the culture at the large. And likewise in creative writing, you're like, oh, there's a problem here. It's like David Hume kind of pointed to that in one of his essays because he was a genius and I really like him. Anyway, you go into all of these kind of, and what you arrive at eventually is kind of the place now where you can see this question of, okay, the issue is that there needs to be the ability of having a robust theme and story, these kind of three things distinct, but always in operation with one another. And that seems to require a kind of Hegelian religious layer. But then the question becomes, what is the nature of that religious layer? The term that I've been using is called alterology, which is an alternative state of being. And that can include technological singularity, psychedelics, religion. These are kind of these alternative states of being. It seems as if in order to have a robust thema that can quote unquote save the arts and by extension save people, because we tend to have a feedback loop where we make ourselves in the light of our arts. So what happens to the arts is actually very important. Like a lot of people don't realize how important the arts are to the overall society. But anyway, so what ends up happening is the question of the different alterologies, and it would seem as if in order to have a robust thema, you need to have an alterology that has some sort of claim on you. And this is what's kind of important. It has to have some sort of claim on you. It can't be you claim it, because then it's mere subjectivity. It doesn't have authority. Like a thema requires some sort of claim on you. Like, and that's where the question, traditionally that was God, that Jesus died on the cross for you, so you better get your act together, and people will have psychedelic experiences and they'll say there's a, whether it's true or not, they have, after a lot of psychedelic experiences, people believe that there is something bigger than themselves that has a claim on them.
What Dr. Lass says about psychedelics in relation to Heidegger, absolutely see that. Like when I do psychedelics, it is absolutely my authentic being coming out. Now, there's times though with the psychedelic where the reverse can happen. Where to use body language, it's the self-centeredness. I'm just dwelling deeper in my self-centeredness. And that's when people say I had a bad trip.
That's right.
That's what a bad trip is. So yeah, not to cut you off.
No, but it's an example, and I am convinced. So I personally came to feel as if a term like alterology was needed, because because the thing is, if you say religion, that means a lot of things to a lot of people. If you say psychedelics, that means a lot of it. But all three, and the technological singularity, that means, and when I say technological singularity, I just mean all of these technologies that could do the thing. GI is fine. All of these kind of technologies that will have some sort of claim on us in an alterological sense. So it felt to me as if a term like alterology was needed to describe what all of these are doing, and they seem to be kind of filling in an alternative kind of being from your being, that kind of Heideggerian distinction, you can even say, that then has a claim on you. And whatever the and so then the question becomes, okay, which of these alterologies can work? And then, of course, what does that mean? And you have to write Belonging Again Part 2, because I just live in my office. What does it mean for an alterology to work? You have to get into that. But it's very clear to me that without an alterology, whether it be psychedelics, Christianity, or techno or something, then you cannot have a robust distinction between theme, and story. It's not possible.
So, I totally with you. So how it has like a presence itself on you.
Yes.
If you will. That is how, so in the paper I sent you, the esoteric nature of it, that is directly what I'm talking about. Like, I didn't want to get people confused where I'm just talking about pouring the lid, because it could be confusing in that sense. But I'm so happy you see that I'm not saying that. It's esoteric in the sense that the self-relation, that continual self-relation, you can't help it. That's all I mean by it. Like a good art, you have this continual self-relation with yourself. And that participation is something that's like esoteric in a sense. Like you're participating, but like you're not in a way.
Right.
Like sure, you could choose to stop thinking about yourself and like get a gun and like shoot yourself in the head, but like practically speaking, I'm saying it's esoteric in that way.
Right.
I think theme. So I'm trying to map now ontology with the whole clearing schema.
Sure.
So again, I don't now. Please, I'm just asking. I don't know if, and then I can get into the sentence, the thematic sentence a little bit. I don't know if ontology is encapsulating clearing, or if it's encapsulating the rising of being in Dasein.
Oh no,
Like,
alterology would not be the sum. Like, in the paper,
I'll make a distinction between. So classically, if I'm just speaking philosophy, there was a distinction between philosophy, philosophical theology, and theology. And you had to go from philosophy to philosophical theology to get to theology. I will say we actually need distinctions today between philosophy, philosophical alterology, and alterology. And how you have to actually have all three because they do different things. Because, like, for example, if I accept the premise that, say, Christianity is true, well, that means I operating according to a different ontology than, say, someone who doesn't believe that Christianity is true. But here's the thing. Let's say I'm a Christian and I believe that ultimately, say, the fundamental lack that human beings have in a Lacanian sense actually ends up being an opening that makes possible the indwelling of the Holy Spirit or something, right? Okay, well, in this life right now, philosophically, Lacan is right, even though Lacan, according to my alterology, is ultimately incomplete because he has to be fit into Christianity. So alterology, you see, so this is why I use kind of the term alterology, is because once you're talking alterology, the ontoepistemology has to shift as well. And so you're not going to get the clearing in the alterology, but from clearing, you can see it according to an alterology if you do the work to get there. So that's where you have to, like, the clearing, like if you say, okay, if my alterology, again, I'll just use the Christianity example, is Christianity, and you're saying my story is going to be in a manner the theme of grace operating in the world according to what's going to break me out of my self-centeredness or self-consciousness, then the story you would tell would be to make a clearing to see the possibility of God's grace moving, but you would simultaneously have to assume that you don't know how that will work because the Holy Spirit operates according to its own way. So on this side, all you can do is make an opening for what the Holy Spirit can do, but the operations of the alterology are not necessarily given, right? You don't know if it's going to actually happen, right? So the clearing could make possible the arising of the alterology, and perhaps you would be making the clearing precisely because of the alterology, but it would not itself be the arising of the alterology. That's why I think it would actually be helpful. It's classically, they had this movement from philosophy to philosophical theology to theology. Today, we'll talk about technological singularity and psychedelics all under philosophy, when that actually, I think, confuses it, actually, because then you're moving between ontoepistemologies. In 1 second, you're talking about Lacan's lack, and then you're talking about like psychedelics being an example of excess that comes out of lack that feels transcendent, and you get confused because, wait a minute, which is when? Well, in a certain alterological state, you have a different ontoepistemology than when you're not in that alterological state. And that's when something more like, say, Lacanian or Hegelian would perhaps be at play. So I think the issue becomes seeing this need for those distinctions and how the questions of sort of the clearing is going to be that's going to be what is making possible the alterology arising, or what you're doing in the name of the alterology, but is not necessarily in the alterology itself. And that is, I think, where it becomes like another example is if you believe, say, the technological singularity is going to forever transform the ontology of the human being so that they don't have a fundamental lack, then you are going to live a story right now to make clearing for the coming of that technological singularity, but the clearing will not equal the technological singularity itself, right? You're only going to live in a way that makes it possible for it to say indwell, to come into, to be in the clearing that you made there. But just because you do the clearing doesn't necessarily mean it will, or it will do so on your terms or the way that you think so. But believing that alterology is eventually going to come will have you say live in a way now so that you have a clearing for it when it does and how it would come. So that would be a way I would reply to that.
That was really well said. That's funny. I mean, I know you talk about the choice. So it's like, okay, you gotta choose. You gotta choose what alterology. You gotta choose. And my question then is, at what point is at what point is a piece of content, if you will, viable to choose?
Mm-hmm.
And that's where I feel like thema really comes into play here. Like, because if you were to ask the question, like, why does the technological singularity, what I was saying, GI, why do I think that why is that my alterology? It's because it's going to save me from the possibility of not being able to ask myself, the Heideggerian question, me being the question, and me being the being in question. I'm scared that I'm not going to be able to ask that question. So I'm just going to propose something to allow me to keep asking that question. So that's why the technological singularity works. So to me, it's giving me an inclination that thema has to do with the very, but at the same time, I don't know if I agree, because it's like, there's something about the survival of the fittest. So it's like, what I was just saying is giving me survival of the fittest vibes in the sense that, like, whatever's going to make my thought survive. And then in that sense, you can get trapped a little bit. You can trick yourself. And that's what we were talking about a little bit with the emails a while ago about delusional thinking and delusional being, essentially. I think it's something that once you make a claim, you can't all eggs can't be in that claim in a way, because then you're possibly delusional.
Yes.
That's basically it.
This is what I like to call the real choice and the final absolute choice, and they kind of go together.
Like in order for, I think, to have theme, and story, and for it to have the possibility of operating in the manners that we have described, that it seems to be necessary for it to so operate to address the meaning crisis and all of these different things. There seems to have to be some sort of significant risk, some sort of significant, say, a real choice is a choice that you make that then is the choice that organizes your reality. And it's real also because you're stuck in it. Like, it becomes what you kind of commit yourself to. Because here's the thing. In order for something to have authority on you, to kind of call on you rather than you call on it, you have to latch yourself to it. Like, what's the key of religion, right? It's a kind of binding, right? You kind of bind it. So, for example, a real choice is having children. Once you have children, you can no longer go back to being someone who didn't have children. You always have a child. It is, quote unquote, a real choice because now it is a certain necessity. You are necessarily someone who has kids. That doesn't mean you're good.
Exactly. And that's what I would call thematic choice.
Yes, it's a thematic choice. I definitely think what I'm saying about real choice and thematic go together. I absolutely. And so now it doesn't mean I'm a good dad. It doesn't mean I'm doing a good job. Those are other questions. And you talk about values in your piece, which was actually excellent. And yeah, I could talk, that was really good. But the point is that I am, I'm forever a dad, right? I am forever someone to have those kids. You'll hear a lot of people ask, how do we know nothing feels real? Everything's a simulation. In the modern world, it kind of nothing feels real, right? You'll hear people say that. I can definitely tell you that if you make a real choice, the world is real. You don't feel that anymore. And, a lot of people will say a part of the meaning crisis is precisely that nothing feels real, right? Nothing feels like it's actually there. Well, a real choice can absolutely fight that feeling and make you feel like the world is concrete, but it comes at the risk of you making a bad choice or a choice that you can never come out of. I don't think there is any possibility of having an alterology that is binding and has the function needed to address the meaning crisis that does not bring with it risk. Right. And it is precisely that risk. I was talking with Raymond about this, though. It's precisely that risk that has a kind of thymos in classical thought, the notion of spiritedness, courage, and how the tripodic soul of human beings, eros, logos, and thymos, it needs all three. Yes. I actually think in this risk of the choosing of an alterology that can address thymos, and I think the real choice is thymos, and also the real choice is necessary for there to be the concrete in Hegel that without you don't even think a thought. Like basically in Hegel, if you don't negate the abstraction into the concrete, it's basically the same as not thinking at all, because you have to make a thought concrete for it to actually be thought. And so in order to kind of get that final sublation in Hegel, then I think you have to make a real choice. And that would also mean binding yourself to a common life in Hegel. So for me, the key is in fact the risk. But the risk, though, this is kind of, I guess, where I get at, if I'm really skipping ahead to like section 60 of belonging again, I don't see how we can replace religion without that kind of risk, because only risk can bind you. Like risk binds you. Like risk, what else can bind you but risk? I mean, if you think about it, all religions were a kind of risk. If you believe in Allah, Allah might not exist, or Allah might disapprove of you. What if you give your life to Jesus and he didn't exist, right? All religion had a risk, but it was a risk that you took. And what was the way that you dealt with risk? Faith. Kind of faith is what gets you through risk, right? Like faith is what gets you through a risk. If you take a risk, well, you have faith that it was a good choice, right? You don't actually know, but you have faith that it's a good choice. And the faith and the hope and the result is what gets you through. And then arguably the love that will keep you kind of committed to people around you.
So to me, the question then is, how are you confident in that choice, in that which you're faithful with? Like, why are you confident?
Why do you make the real choice that you make? Why do you make the final absolute choice?
It's the same question. It's the same question as when I propose in my paper, which is, why is there content on the screen versus no content at all, or different content altogether? Like, why that?
Yes.
So it's like, let's mitigate the anxiety here. Like, let's embrace the risk, but mitigate anxiety.
Yes.
Like that to me is the sweet spot.
Yes, I agree. That's a very good way to put it. So
to me, that is the storyteller method, or the not method, process. That's what I would propose. So it's like I love like the child example. Now, I have no child, so I can't really tell you, but like, I can tell you that, so to get a little personal, I guess, let's say you don't have a child. I never had a child, but I can experience something similar in the sense that like I have a mother, but I had a very contentious relationship with her. So I didn't talk to her. She was out of my life for like 7 years. So the loss of that and like the choice in that, because it is a two-way street in that choice.
Yes.
So the choice in that was very thematic in the sense that though I didn't gain something in my life, like my mom and I are best friends now, so everything's good. But like, though I didn't gain something like a child, the loss of something, not, I don't want to say equally profound, but it had, but it it's profound equally in the sense that it has to do with the very makeup of your being. Like now that you have a child, that that is, from my understanding, a new makeup of your being.
Yes. Yes.
Your parents are the origin of the makeup of your being. It's just two different points in the same like chart, so to speak, the chart of yourself.
Yes.
So when you make a choice like that, there is a way to get your thinking in the right place in order to be confident in a choice of such degree.
Yes.
And I would like to think that like my experience with that also helped me get to like a place of understanding how to be confident in a choice that's hard to make.
Yes.
Like deciding to have a child is a tough decision. Like obviously, like if you're in love, it's an easy decision in the right moment, but like the ability to get there and have that loving situation was tough to get to in a way. Like
Yes.
there was a lot of right that had to get there.
Yes.
Like just because you think it's not tough doesn't make it not tough in terms of the condition happening itself. Um, so so to tie it into the thematic sentence now, in my paper I say that the most foundational, well, first let me one thing at a time here. I claim that a theme is a command, is a sentence that has a subject and predicate, not only a sentence that has a subject and predicate. And the reason why I break it down in terms of subject and predicate is because of how I treat it, like Heidegger treats getting rid of subject and object,
Right.
where I treat the subject and the predicate, the object, as one collective sentence that's collected by the copula, that's collected by the is, and that the elemental aspects of that sentence, and this is where I feel like I can probably echo Nishitani a little bit, but like the elemental aspects of that sentence is always going to be either ego and or ethic base.
Right.
And what I mean by that is ego is the parent, is what you think about the world, and ethics is what the world thinks about you. So it's basically taking the experiential aspect and metaphorically putting it into a sentence. So Heidegger says being in the world, that's because of this mutual arena, to use a Vervaeke language, agent arena situation. Like one elemental prong, the subject or predicate, one represents the arena and the other represents the other,
Right.
so to speak. So they're always in contention, if you will. And when you make a choice, you need to think about, okay, I talk about sequences a lot in my paper, and you have to look at this question that's appearing in front of me where I have to make a choice. Where did this question come from? You need to trace the question's roots to your subjective conclusion. It is a subjective conclusion because only your subject, so to speak, can trace back your own questioning.
Right.
So you have to take the time to trace back the roots, and you need to ask yourself, when you answer that root question, why am I answering it like that? What is my answer saying about this theme that I know is there in the answer or situation, happening, event, whatever you want to call it. When you say this is something that I think about the case, then you know it's ego based.
Right.
And and this sounds a little crude, but when you think about this is what the world thinks. Now that sounds a little like it sounds impossible to do, but it's an example. Like you're speeding.
Mm.
Like it's good for me to speed right now because I'm gonna get to work on time. But I know the world doesn't want me to speed because there's a sign that says that I'm speeding.
Right.
That's indicating to me that I'm speeding. So I'm doing something not ethical in the thematic sense because the world doesn't want me to do it. But let's say I'm an ambulance and it's like,
right.
or just like I'm in a rush because it could still be good that I'm speeding, even though that I'm breaking the world's way of how I should act.
Right.
It's a balance of both.
Mm-hmm.
And understanding what each decision where it lays. And then understanding that if you start a sequence in an egoistic way, in a thematic egoistic way, you will end up on the other side of the pendulum because that is how how story unfolds. So it's like if you choose to speed, odds are at the end of the sequence you're choosing something that will be what the world wants you to do.
Right.
And that I would say that's like a crude, I guess, outline of my proposal, but I just think it's having a every day, to bring like a Heidegger term, that like an everyday viewpoint of yourself. And like that is embracing like the vulgar understanding of yourself, and then once you embrace it, asking yourself like, where does it come from? And then that's when the authentic answers come about. So it's like it's like you have to ask, you have to embrace your emotion a little bit and kind of go where the wind takes you at first. And then when you're about to make that choice in whatever decision you're about to make, you have to stop yourself and say, where is this now? Now, where is this choice coming from? Now that the vulgarness has reared its head, where is it now coming from? And that's where like a lot of my like thinking comes from Heidegger.
No, everything you said is brilliant. And a few things. First, before I forget, something I wanted to say earlier. I think a reason why people don't realize there is kind of actually are objective standards of good art from bad art is because it comes out in the rereading or the rewatching, and people don't do that. People certainly don't reread books, because you talked about how the relationality transforms. Well, that would require you to reread a work or to rewatch a work to see that transformation. And if people don't do that because they don't want to miss the next great thing, like everyone wants a new book, a new experience, then you don't see that emergence, that transformation. I think the lack of rereading books, especially books, contributes to this problem. That makes it seem like there isn't that you can't overcome the problem of how you can know that there's theme in the story, as opposed to imposed onto it, because that would require rewriting, which actually makes me think about this interesting in Hegel, and Zizek will talk about this, how in order to the repetition is the negation. When you repeat something, that's when you see if it actually is the sublation or if there's nothing there, like an effacement. Yes. But you have to have the repetition. So the lack of the repetition contributes to people thinking that there are not objective standards in art. I meant to say that earlier. A few more things. What you are saying, the parts where you talk about ethics, values, good, bad, and that you were just touching on, it would be difficult for me to overstate how important I think that is. There's a work in Thoughts that's a small version of a paper called Immorality, with the IAM in parentheses. And basically it's going to talk about absolute moral conditionalism, which is the notion that murder is always wrong. That's an absolute moral principle. The issue is that you have to be in the common life to tell what examples of killing are murder as opposed to just killing. right? Like all murder is killing, but not all killing is murder, right? So how do you tell which is which? Well, you have to be in the common life. You have to know the story of how the killing occurred. Otherwise, you cannot determine if it's murder or not. And so for me, this is a big deal because it suggests that if you have like absolute ethics that don't take seriously the story, it becomes totalitarianism. You know, we talked about that earlier because you just kind of come in and say, oh, this must have been murder because it was killing. But the farmer's like, no, that's not, the cow, we actually eat meat here. And it's like, well, but then that story, right? We say, well, for me, all sentient life is equally valuable. So you committed murder. Well, people are it's different stories that they're occupying in. So you cannot separate moral evaluations from the story. Or for me, I think the paper mentions metaphysical frameworks, et cetera, so forth. So I think that's very important. And the issue with that, though, is that would suggest that in order to determine the good life, because that always has an ethical, determining what you should do, whether it's eating ice cream or not, has an ethical tinge, because basically you're saying you shouldn't murder, you shouldn't do that. So there's a element of, it's a guiding principle of everyday life that always has to be relative to something bigger than yourself, basically. It has to be always relative to a story. And what you're talking about that I think is getting at the solution or the answer, this ontological question, is that you consciously are aware that your choices are relative to a metaphysical framework, or I'll say story. And you have that story compel you, as opposed to you think that that story is at your mercy, like that it has to bend to you. And so you actually do say, no, murder is always wrong. And this is, I guess, how I would balance where you're talking about story and theme go together, but there is kind of a theme where you say murder is always wrong. But I am the one that has to be in the story to tell when killing is murder versus not. So I can't just say murder is always wrong and therefore know how to live, or what should be done. I become a necessary part of the determination of what killing is murder. And there's no way for a given example of killing to be determined as murder without some sort of story, without some sort of person in the story, without someone carrying someone in the clearing, if you will. Right. And so the very schema where theme, and story operate requires the storyteller with the hyphen. You have to be there, or else, because saying all murder is wrong, murder is always wrong, is not a story. It doesn't give you the story. It simply suggests what evaluations can occur within a story, but there must be a storyteller there to make those evaluations. And so then this brings us back to the ontological question. So then this is the question. If you evaluate that the real choice you should make is to favor the technological singularity, the question is the following: why do you have confidence in that evaluation? So let's go back to the murder example. You would say, well, I have confidence that this killing is murder because I saw a person get killed who didn't want to die. They were resisting, right? I'm using a very violent example, but that's just where I ended up, right? So from my experience, when somebody doesn't want to die and they get killed, that's wrong. And there's reason to think that is wrong, because if I lived in a society where it wasn't wrong, everything would collapse. Nothing would operate. There'd be infinite anxiety, right? There would be infinite anxiety. And if there's infinite anxiety and there's no possibility of a social order, it would be impossible for there to be a world that could put summons on me in which I could then organize my life. So another reason to have confidence in that evaluation is precisely because without that evaluation, there would be no world that you could be in that would make it even possible for you to engage in evaluations. So the evaluation is tied to, it's part of the very existence of the framework for the evaluation to occur. And in that way, it becomes more axiomatic. So it's not merely you are evaluating that chocolate is better than vanilla, because society would be fine if everyone liked vanilla instead of chocolate, the social order wouldn't collapse, right? But if people disagreed on if, say, murder was wrong or not, well, then the social order may be in trouble, right? That's going to be tagged into the very possibility of there being other people of whom you can interact with and therefore engage in a story with and make possible your own story without. So it's tied, so it becomes axiomatic. And this also, I think, suggests why the becoming other in Hegel is so important. Like for Hegel, self-consciousness to become reason is where you treat other world, other people, that is other, as actual as you, as significant as you. So becoming other, the movement from self-consciousness to reason, what I call the absolute choice, I think is part of this because what you're doing is you're saying that evaluations that make possible the evaluation itself are things you should have confidence in. So they're kind of axiomatic, you see? So the thing is, if you kind of, so then you're at like, which alterology you're going to pick, okay? And you sort of go, okay, I can have confidence in X choice that I make versus Y, because X is what makes it possible for the world in which I can even make the evaluation of X. So for example, let's say you go with the technological singularity. And you would say, well, technology has made my world. Technology has helped me interact with Andrew. Technology has helped me get to work and like type my books and different things. So technology overall has been a good thing. Technology has been something that, say, has allowed me to follow the story that I have wanted to follow according to the theme that I have wanted to follow. Therefore, I am going to have confidence in my evaluation that the alterology I am going to operate according to is the technological singularity. Someone else may say, I'm going to follow the alterology of Christianity because I have had a sacrificial, I have seen where the person of Jesus in his life has a certain ability to call people outside of themselves to be there with other people. And I have seen how that has helped form community and has helped family. Therefore, I have evaluated that the alterology of Christianity is the one that I like, and I'm going to commit to it. So, and you can kind of look back on your life and say, man, if there was no Christianity, I wouldn't have met X people, I wouldn't have done Y thing, and therefore it is what made my world so that I can even engage in these evaluations, and therefore that's what I choose. But here's the risk. What if you're just in a conspiracy, right? What if you're deluded? What if you only think that because you were born into Christianity? You cannot avoid the risk. That is part of the story. That is part of the thymos. That is part of the tension. The evaluation always has to come with risk. But the question is, I think you put it very well, how can you reduce the anxiety, right? How can you reduce the anxiety? Well, look back and like closely examine what Christianity did. Closely examine what Christianity is. Closely examine what technology has done or what psychedelics has done. But that gets into being the storyteller with the hyphen and looking at the things as opposed to just getting swept in by it. I think if you're just swept in by it into making the if you're swept into Christianity, then the chances of the alterological choice being problematic are much higher than if you're in the business of storyteller with the hyphen.
I have so much to say from that. Like if you were to use, here's like the problem. If you were to use like John's language, like the salience landscape, like what's salient to you is based on whether for one, let's say you're a storyteller without the hyphen, what's salient to you is very different than the storyteller with a hyphen. So to me, it's like, if you're going to talk about what's salient, you have to have a good understanding of story. Having a storyteller with a hyphen, understanding about what you're looking at, to me, reminds me of Nishitani in the sense that you're able to, and this kind of goes back to our first conversation, like how you appropriate the ises in your life will allow you for one, like how you write about forgiveness in thoughts, like forgiveness can actually occur more.
Right.
For example, you're able to progress with other competing alterologies.
Yes.
Without the alterology overstepping its bounds and squashing your alterology. So to me, if you have salience landscaping without the storyteller with a hyphen emphasis, the real possibility of ontology squashing is very, very likely, where there can be a monopoly on ontology again, and which will lead to the collapse of an ontology, which will lead to another meaning crisis.
I think so. As just a quick comment to what you're saying, I think it is extremely important to be asking questions like, has my life been stoic? Like, if I'm just to speak very generally, I always like asking the question instead of what is the meaning of my life. I like to ask questions more like, is my life a story? How is this part of a story, this choice? How is this part of character development? How is this part of, facing the conflicts, facing fears? Like, I think of life in kind of a story term, and that's not always salient. That's not always a salient dimension. Sometimes it's mundane. Sometimes it's like fixing the garden. Sometimes it's changing the baby's diaper. Is this salient? I don't know. It's what you have to do for the story. It's what must be done for the story and your development in the story. And that is, I think, a different rubric. And then, of course, another heuristic is I like to ask, instead of questions like, what is the meaning of your life? Like, what is your life beautiful? Because beauty also, another factor of this that I'll pause on and give it back to you is I think thinking in terms of beauty, because beauty is something bigger than yourself that calls out of yourself, is also another very useful heuristic for finding confidence in your alterological choice, your real choice for an alterology. If it is beautiful to you, that would give you reason to have confidence in that choice, precisely because the beauty is not mere pleasure. It suggests something bigger than yourself that is open to you to allow you to participate in it, but is not reducible to you. So for me, like this, because the major question is being asked is, how do you have confidence in your alterological choice and also not become totalitarian in it either, right? Like, where you're like oppressing others. It seems to have something to do, or is useful to have thought of your life in terms of story and in terms of beauty. That's why I like belonging again in the truths of the rational leads to the fate of beauty, because the fate of beauty, the line is the fate of beauty is the fate of us. And it would seem that a lot of our ability to kind of sustain our real choice has something to do with feeling like it's part of a story, feeling like it is the development of a story that is not just arbitrary, and that it has some sort of increase of wonder, awe, beauty, and things like that. So that's just a note, and I'll give it back to you.
So confidence in alterology and that question as it relates to beauty. Well, actually, a quick side note. What's interesting about beauty to me is that though beauty isn't a mere pleasure, there's still a thematic element to beauty where it's like it's only beautiful because of the current positionality.
Yes.
So in that sense, it's like kind of, again, ontological design vibes, where it's like, what is beauty when you can design beauty?
Mm-hmm.
Well,
this is not to interrupt, but that's $1 million question, and there's a paper on beauty. But one of the things is that there seems to be beauty designed according to a story, and beauty designed according to what we know is going to activate your dopamine. And so there seems to be like, is it like there's the beauty of the battlefield? There's the beauty of like the dance. There's the beauty. It's not mere like there's a beauty of a painting, but there's also the beauty of, say, the art. And it's always important to remember that art used to be skill. Now art is something you hang on a wall, but art used to be something you did. Beauty was something you were. Beauty was not something, but it was also critically, beauty was something you were when you participated in something bigger than yourself that was difficult to be put in words. Like you are participating somehow in like an honor, but what is honor and relative to what? Well, it's kind of bigger. That's thema, right? Beauty is something you did. So it seems to be also a difference between we can design a beauty to put on your wall that you find beautiful. And then, of course, yeah, it seems like we're starting to ontologically design ourselves. But that distinction between sort of the beauty of the art of self, of you, seems to be different than kind of the beauty that hangs on a wall. And yet there also simultaneously seems to be mysterious connections, because the subject-object divide has to be deconstructed, right? So, right. That would be a comment I would make to you.
No, Totally. So because beauty has this dual understanding of it being a dopamine and it being a story, that's a good way of looking at whether an alterology is valid or not, if you will. Because the thing with then I'm Jewish, so I'll just use Jewish as if everything is if like your Judaism is unshaken because it's everything you know, that seems to me that it gives credence to like the dopamine path and not the story, because you actually are just succumbing to the pleasure of it already being at home, if you will. Like for it to be the story type of beauty, you need to, and this is now very Heideggerian, you need to be thrown out of that initial home and you need to find a new one. You need to get entangled into the world. You need to get lost. You need to be found in a new home and understand that that's just a possible home, and therefore you always have the possibility of being lost. That's what having that Heideggerian mindset means to me. So I just think that you can have the Christian alterology, the Jewish alterology, if it's found within the story, not from the fact that you were raised in it. It can't just be a given.
Right.
You have to give it to yourself for it to be a story.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, this is where, to me, like in belonging again, there's the distinction between like givens and releases. What later on we'll talk about is we'll see like what is the possibility of a chosen given that still functions as a given, because that would seem to be a contradiction. Because if it's given, you don't choose it, like it's just given. And so the moment you choose a given, it would seem like it would be therapeutic in the kind of Philibrief way. And that means it doesn't function as a given. That means it's just an expression of your subjectivity and what you want to do. And that's like the whole problem, because then it's pure release, right? Well, this is the issue of alterology, because you indeed choose an alterology, but it somehow doesn't function. It doesn't seem like it has to function as pure therapeutically, because it can put demands on you that then are not therapeutic. It's chosen, and yet it functions as a given. So this
I would say that's part of the story side of beauty. Like those demands, if you don't have those demands, then that's also another good guess that it's the desire aspect.
No, because what would no, you did. That's exactly right. Because what we're getting at is, okay, how do you evaluate your alterological choice? And I've called it a real choice. I've called it the final absolute choice. I'm just coming up with as many phrases as I can, but they're all the same in this context. They're all the same, and they're basically all the same. Anyway, so the evaluation of your evaluation. What we're suggesting, the problem seems to be, at the alterological choice, you have to choose something that's going to function as a given, and by definition, a chosen given isn't a given, and yet somehow this has to be a given. And the amount of things that are going to successfully have that very paradoxical function seems very limited. It doesn't seem like many things can do it. Like I can think of religion, I can think of technological singularity, I can think of psychedelics. It's very difficult to think of other things that can have this kind of thema role that seems so important. I'm not saying there aren't others. It just seems very difficult to think. I could right now come up with probably who knows how many themes, but themas seem very difficult, and so how do you evaluate if your alterological choice will successfully function as a chosen given? Well, the dilemma seems to be, how do you make sure it's not a secret expression of desire, right? And so what heuristics? For me personally, the heuristics that seem most reliable to me, and we've already stated them, seem to have something to do, does this alterology create story, character, and beauty? If it does, the probability that it is a good that it is actually a good alterology, or one that I should choose, is significantly higher. And if it does create story in my life, if it does create character, and if it does create beauty, well, there would be reason to think that I should do this. Now, those three categories, though, are not self-evident in what they mean. Like, how do you have a story? Well, I would argue it's going to be hard to have story without community and other people. I would say it'd be hard to have story without thymos. It would be hard to have story without conflict, even though, you know, we haven't, you know, there's the problem of people thinking that story is just conflict, right? Then we'd have the question of what is character? Well, that's going to get, well, what's the difference between, say, Nietzsche and Jesus or something? Like, we have to go through those. And then, of course, what is beauty? And you have to do the book, The Fate of Beauty. But if you can go through all of those and arrive at answers to those categories that you go, these are good answers by the evaluate, you know, that has to be according to your story. We said that earlier, right? Like you say, these are good answers. Well, then there would be reason to have confidence in your alterological choice, which, though, of course, there would still be risk, there would be reason not to have as much anxiety, because that's ultimately kind of what we're asking. Like, how do you not have as much anxiety? Which I think is exactly the right question, because the problem of losing givens is that it creates anxiety. Like, once you don't have a given, belonging again, we'll talk about, you have existential anxiety. So the loss of givens is a problem because it creates anxiety, which then makes totalitarianism appealing, strongmen, and all these different things. So a chosen given has to reduce anxiety for it to have the function of traditional givens. You see what I'm saying? So then, but the very fact it has to be chosen creates a problem, because if it's a chosen given, then it creates anxiety, because where there's choice, there's anxiety. That's why this special category of chosen givens is so rare, and it seems to have, then it would be the alterological choice. And then to have confidence in that alterological choice, it would seem to have something to do with one evaluating that their answer, that the alterology creates story, character, and beauty, and that how you then define story, character, and beauty according to that alterology is acceptable to you, is good to you. Now, of course, that's a closed loop, so you could be in a giant conspiracy, you could be entirely wrong, but that risk is necessary. That risk is part of the concretion that makes it thematic. It addresses you in the thematic and also the thymo sense that you must do if you are to live a life where theme, and story are independent and informing one another. So so to me, story, character, and beauty become kind of useful heuristics to kind of guide and evaluate if the alterological choice is valid or not, or a good one, or one you should make.
Right. So like, I completely agree. I would, what I'm thinking right now is, and I'll clarify that to be confident in your alterology is to be understanding how it's thematic.
Yeah.
So like, you brought up conflict, and this is gonna be a little like paradoxical sounding to like my Jewish Christian comment before, but if it's causing, so there's the surface level conflict that I talk about, but if it's causing this elemental conflict, then you know you have something, I would say. So like Christianity, I have Christian friends that or Catholic friends that they find themselves in conflict, but not just like a conflict like I missed the bus conflict, like conflict in like like their ground. There's a conflict in their ground. And because Christianity, the Catholic Church, the Bible brought their thinking, cleared a path enough to get to a ground, they start getting anxiety about their ground. And like, to me, that type of conflict is a sign that there is actually a ground that you're standing on.
Yes.
So like, with the technological singularity, there's that conflict that comes with that too, where there's like, oh my God, like, are we gonna just be robots? Like, there's like, are we destroying the ground in which humans are in with this technological singularity? So there's like the same sentiment where it's like, if there's no God, then like, my humanness is means nothing. Like it's the same thing. If this technological singularity can save everything, then my humanness means nothing. Like that's how the sentiments are the same. So like and this is where I think Nishitani is amazing. It's like if you could put the nihility into the object into the conceptual object right now in this conceptual realm that we're talking in, then it's viable.
Right.
There's that nihility. Jeez.
It's a hard word. Yeah.
Yeah, but and I think that's what he's talking about. That religion is that which can bring nihility to life.
Yes. Yeah, no, a few things. I think Zizek or Lacan have this line where they say anxiety is the only emotion that doesn't lie. Anxiety never lies. And there is a funny way, like I should clarify, there is one sense in which anxiety is evidence that an alterology is worth considering. The very fact that it makes you feel anxious means it's something that you should worth considering. But then there's the question of like, how does one then live with the anxiety or live with the risk? And that's when you then, from the anxiety, go to like questions of character, beauty, and story. I'm not meaning to say that like for me.
I know.
Well, but I didn't say, to clarify, it's a very important clarification. Like I always take the Dante conception quite. The only way to freaking Beatrice is through hell and purgatory. You cannot get to the beatific vision, if you will, without the purgatory. There's no way. And anxiety is a necessary step on that sort of purgatorial development. Purgatory is kind of the taking the bath so that you're clean. And it makes sense because if you're like, if you've done something wrong and you encounter like a really good person, you feel shame, right? They're not doing anything to make you feel shame. You just feel it, right? And so like anxiety is also something that just naturally occurs when you realize the problem of ground, if you will, or the problem. So it's really funny because if you never feel anxiety, that's a problem. But also if you face anxiety and you don't know what to do then, that's a problem. The question is like going through anxiety. How do you go through anxiety and how do you integrate with anxiety, which to me is the question of integrating with lack, as I've talked about with like Last and Mr. Ebert and Mr. Edlin.
And I would for me, that's reminiscent of the anxiety that screenwriters face when facing a new story. It's like, oh my God, these infinite possibilities. What do I do? Like, so even though they're in different arenas, I definitely think the sentiment is totally compatible.
If you never, arguably the problem
I love the Lack series, by the way.
Well, you're very kind, sir. And what you're saying also with Nishitani, the notion of the apathetic, the lack of this kind of nothing that is actually a fullness. Basically, every religion that isn't apathetic is doomed. And I think you see that. Now, people have to understand that when you talk about negative theology, you're not literally, when Master Eckhart says, for example, that God is nothing, he doesn't mean like literally God is nothing. He means that God is such a supersaturated phenomenon, to use the John Luke Marion term, that you can't understand God, right? So likewise, religion that doesn't have a lack, and a lack is not nothing, a lack is a present absence, it's doomed. And basically, the only alterology that will survive has to be apathetic somehow. It has to have a lack to it. It has to have a kind of fullness that you can't fully comprehend. You see that in psychedelics. You see that in technological singularity. There is indeed a lack there. In religions that do well, there's an apathetic dimension, right? But wherever there's the apathetic, there has to be anxiety, precisely because you must realize you are a being that cannot fully comprehend the thing. So the anxiety is on your side of the equation, and it's unavoidable. And so that's not evidence that the alterology itself is invalid. That can be evidence that you're not at the place yet where you can handle the alterology. So you now need to do the work of story, character, and beauty. Like you need to, beauty for me, I should clarify, also gets tied up with intrinsic motivation, aesthetic sensibilities, and questions of kind of wonder. Because like when you find life wonderful or beautiful, or you see life worth living that has a motivating principle. And so, that kind of gets tied into that. I would have to elaborate on that, but if you grant me that here, I would appreciate it. But you see, that's when anxiety is where you kind of fall back. It's almost like, for me, anxiety is when you realize you need to make an ontological choice, and then you fall back so you can get ready for the ontological choice until you're ready to go back, and now you can make it, right? But you have to have that anxiety. It's like Dante trying to climb the hill, and there's the animals, the she-wolf. He's like, you can't go this way. You have to, you can't cheat. Can't cheat. You got to go back. You got to go back. You got to go through Inferno and the Purgatory. So if you never encounter anxiety, that means you don't realize there's an ontological choice. Well, that's where you get all the problems we've talked about. That's where you get it. But then here's the key, though. A lot of people, when they encounter the ontological choice and feel the anxiety, they can make the mistake of thinking that the feeling of anxiety is evidence that they're doing something wrong. You say, oh, if I feel this way, I must be doing something wrong. Oh, let me go back to ignoring ontology. And I'm afraid that's what kind of my critique of existentialism in generalism, because there's a question of what's the difference between lack and existentialism, right? For me, existentialism, unfortunately, conflates lack and nothing and takes anxiety as not a purgatory, but evidence of a mistake. Now, Kierkegaard doesn't. I mean, that's a different matter, but Kierkegaard, I don't think is the premier thinker of a lot of existential thinking. This is also why it's actually a mistake to say Heidegger is just an existentialist, because, anxiety does not have this kind of oops kind of function to it, where true existential, like I think existentialism that is most clearly existentialism does end up in absurdism, like Camus. I think it must, because anxiety is evidence of a dead end, that now you're dead end. You've reached the end. And so, but in alterology, it's like anxiety is the realization that a choice has to be made, and then you back up so you can prepare, and then you go forward again when you can to make the choice, and you'll be able to stand it. Now you can make the real choice. You would never prepare for the real choice if you didn't know that you needed to make a real choice. And that's where anxiety is kind of a necessary prerequisite, because it's saying that you need to go back and get ready, and then come forth when you're ready. And frankly, a lot of literature will have stories of the hero kind of almost getting ahead of themselves and then having to go back. Like they'll fight the main boss and get the crap beat out of them, and they have to go back. You see in some narratives that kind of structure where the right. hero gets ahead of themselves, and then they have to go back and learn something. And I think there's something in the ontological choice that suggests that.
Absolutely. Not only within the story itself, but in the creation of the story itself that is occurring. So yes. like to me, that movement that you're describing, I completely agree. To just translate it into my own language, it would just be the discovery of that choice, that there's a choice to be made, is a discovery.
Yes.
And then you fall back from that discovery and you start. This is where intentionality starts coming alive, and basically you have an intention toward the choice that you discovered, and in doing so, there's a whole structure, there's a whole domain. So like when you realize, when the choice is realizable, when you discover the choice, there's a domain that's discovered within that. So when you fall back, you reflect on that domain. So to me, that domain, and this is where like I feel like Aristotle comes into play here a little bit. So like that domain to me is story. So there's story structure. That is crudely, there's a beginning, middle, and end in our finite life. Now, I don't want this to get confused with like with time, because I definitely agree with Heidegger in his sense of time, but that's on a side note. I guess I can clarify that in a little bit. When you take a step back, it's like, okay, I know there's a beginning, middle, and end. I know there's an exposition, and then I'm gonna just translate this into like screenwriting terms. I know there's an exposition. I know there's an inciting incident. I know there's a pinch point 1, a pinch point 2, a midpoint, a climax, a resolution. Just to give it like a rough sketching of the domain, the structure of story structure. So then it's like, okay, But how do I, now that I realize the domain, how do I know? I have to answer why I discovered it in the first place.
Yeah.
So answering that question basically means, what is the meaning behind this? Yep. It's like, okay, I discovered the domain, but why? And then once you answer that why, then you're able to come back to it and do the work without thinking. Now, that's not to say without thought, but you've done the thinking that's required to get to the point where you're in a non-thinking state and you can just act.
Right.
So to me, the why, once you understand the domain in what you're in, the story structure in this case, there's that why you're able to discover it in the first place. And in that sense, there's a domain there, there's a container there. And that domain in my paper, I claim, has not been fleshed out. So I attempt to flesh out the thematic structure of the discovery of the story domain or structure, however you want to call it. So in doing so, when you're coming from a story structure place, you're not asking questions like, why is that existing? You're asking questions like, I need to fill in this part because it's this part.
Right.
You're thinking about it in a particular way. You're talking about it. You're not coming at it from an elemental sense, to bring up Nishitani. You don't have that breakthrough that he talks about. That breakthrough doesn't occur. So when you are only thinking about the story structure of your story, you're not able to really be confident about your content because you're looking at it myopically. And then, so the thematic structure, it starts with the thematic sentence. So like I was saying earlier, so you have your thematic sentence. So like the most, I would say, primal one is, don't let your ego change your ethics, or your ethics change your ego. You use ego and ethics, and I explained that already. And the reason why I say don't is because it's a command.
Right.
You're commanding the protagonist. You're throwing the protagonist already situated to be Heideggerian. He's already situated in a mood. Right. So from that already situated state, how do I know what they're going to do? How do I know the progression? And in doing so, I came up with terms called sync beat, cat sync beat, and a cat beat. And they're to be used in tandem with these other terms called bounce and distance. For example, bounce and distance only apply to the thematic structure, where the sync beats, the cat sync beats, the cat beats, they apply to story structure, but they have a dualness to them where they are open to thematic structure seeping into the story structure. So as of right now, there isn't, to my knowledge, there is no terminology that allows for meaning to just seep through, like to arise. Right now, if you only look at story structure, you can only pour in the theme on top because there's no actual opening for it to just like seep on in, so to speak. So when you have a sync beat, you're understanding, first, you're understanding everything in terms of a sequence. And in that sense, the sync beat what I mean by that is it's at the beginning of a sequence. It is a pure inference. And what that means is that it can mean anything at that point. The meaning is not contained yet.
Right.
You can't actually relate to it. It's like seeing the color green. That could mean anything.
Right.
Like put green on like a book means nothing. You put green on a piece of rectangular square paper means money. Big difference. So when you're at the beginning of a sequence, there's so many terms that I have to go over. I feel so you need to, when you're at the beginning of a sequence, you need to have the correct thematic mentalities in mind. So the thematic mentalities are bounce and distance. And what that simply means is bounce is when the protagonist is thrown, it takes that thrownness and it says, how can I continue to throw the protagonist?
Right.
And what that means is it takes the past history, and this is where like Heidegger's historicity really comes into play here. He takes in the historicity and you allow the protagonist to continually morph into its next beat. So bounce is having the thought of how did I get here? Where am I going next? And how does it relate to where I am now?
Right.
And how does it relate to where I was?
Right.
Then you have the protagonist progressing, and then you have distance. And distance is literally it's that which is concealing where the understanding is actually going. So when you understand something, you only understand it in terms of the history of it and where you think it's going, where it makes sense to you in that moment. But distance says that's only what you understand in that position. You're not actually accounting for the ultimate positionality, the gestalt of the story. Distance is looking at the protagonist from the gestalt point, right, and saying you're not at the point of realizing your own meaning yet. So I'm going to distance you from getting there. Right. Where bounce is literally trying to get there, but is unable to see the gestalt.
Right.
So how does the thematic mentalities incorporate into the story structure beats that give opening to the thematic mentalities to seep in? So the story structure beats, so when you have a sync beat, you're always thinking of bounce and distance, always. But I always say in the beginning of a sequence, you need to think the most distance possible. The first beat is, you should have in mind, the very first thing in your mind is distance, because ipso facto, you're already thinking about bounce, because for you to already arrive at coming up with the content in the first beat means you already know the ending, right, means that there's already a possible thrownness that's occurring. So you have to distance yourself from that possibility becoming an actuality, because story structure says it's the exposition.
Right.
You're in the beginning. So it's like story structure dictates the tempo in which the thematic mentalities can unfold. And I use bounce and distance because they also they're conflicting with each other.
Right.
The conflict. So you're allowing the conflict of bounce and distance to unfold in its proper pacing because of the sync beat, the cat beat, the cat sync beat.
The very fact that human beings have to make an ontological choice can be seen as kind of a story.
the very fact that you can come to that place, the very fact that you have from a certain framing, you could turn the meaning crisis into story, into theme.
Right.
Like they themselves are the theme. You know, the theme is the meaning crisis. The story is the unfolding of that. And the thema ultimately becomes the alterological choice, or the alterology in the background, that then when you get to the point in your story when you realize that that is always what's kind of undergirding the very theme and story and operation, you have to then choose what it is and what you are living out. And then you make the choice. This is what's interesting. It seems to me that you make the alterological choice relative to what you will see your story and theme as always have been participating in. That's what's very interesting. The alterological choice has to feel like it makes what you've gone through always already part of it. And that's where it seems to be so sustainable. Like the alterological choice will not work if there's like a break between the choice you make and the story you live, because it doesn't add up to it. Like whatever alterological choice you make will only work as such if it makes your entire life always already part of it. And so the meaning is seeping through, right? It's actually what it was always trying to seep through, and it was always there glimmering through. You just didn't have the eyes to see it as glimmering through until you made this choice. And that's very different from theme, where you get to the end and then go, hey, what was the meaning of all that we're now going to retrospectively sum up and like write a paper on, versus, oh, now I know what was always coming through. Now I have the eyes to see what was always coming through. And now it was always already there. I just didn't realize it. You know, generally it's the difference between creation and realization, which is kind of funny, because realization has a kind of creative element to it. You now recreate the meaning of your entire life. And yet it's a realization. It's a paradoxical. Realization is paradoxically creative in the same way that a chosen given is paradoxical. So we should expect that, because it kind of matches up, right? And so in another way too, it's like, and I think this fits with clearing, because I can't really draw it, or it won't really fit. Like if I have this paper, and this paper is in fact all alterology, right? And I draw a circle. The clearing right there has the meaning in it. You know, there's nothing in the circle, just a circle on like a piece of paper. But you see, I have to make a clearing in which, in that clearing, I will then realize that this entire sticky note is actually alterology. It is actually meaningful. And it is in this clearing that I am able to see that let's put it this way. It is only in a clearing that meaning can seep through, right? Like that's the only space you can see through. If you build a building, well, nothing can seep out of the ground. You got a building on top of it. So, and by definition, an alterology cannot be a building. It has to be something that seeps through. It has to be a ground. It has to be a thema. A thema cannot be constructed. It has to be participated in. And so the only sort of metaphoric act of which is going to make it possible for a meaning to seep in must be in its nature a clearing. And you see, there's a way in which when you come to the alterological choice, you are clearing aside your preconceived notions of what your life meant. You are making an opening, and almost like a sacrificial altar, where you're like, I am going to be willing to have what my life means and was possibly totally always already transformed once and forever once I make this choice. Like I am kind of putting it, I'm risking it. I'm risking the meaning of my entire life always already once I make this alterological choice. And this is what must occur. And in this risk, in this sort of clearing aside preconceived notions to make possible this alterological noise, and then having your life be a clearing where meaning can seep through, all of this then sets your life up to be a story, to have the meaning come through. So that very design of the alterological choice has in of itself the story dimension to it.
Yeah, that was really well said. That reminded me what I was going to say, and it kind of just to piggyback off that sentiment. That process that really seems like a story definitely reflects what a story is. It's the way you talked about it. Absolutely. That process. So like, to really think about it from a screenwriter perspective, the that process, the clearing is a way of looking at the domain of story. So like you have to first have a paradigm shift and look at the story in a way that allows there to be a clearing for meaning to seep in or to arise out of. So that's where the like within the screenwriter experience, the sync beat, cat beat, cat beat really come in handy. So
That's right.
so like the sync beat basically infers the theme, where it essentially props up what's to follow, which is a cat sync beat. So a cat sync beat just gives content understanding about the theme, which I characterize understanding is different than knowledge. So then the cat sync beat then props up to be a cat beat, which I say is giving knowledge of the theme.
Right.
So when I look at the exposition, inciting incident, climax, resolution, I look at those terms as sequences. And at the beginning of an exposition, the sequence of an exposition is you take that sequence and then you look at each scene as its own story in itself, where that in itself has its own sequence with an exposition, inciting incident, climax, resolution. And like you keep going micro until you can't. And like you can't because there's nothing more micro than the individual scene.
Right.
So to me, what's interesting is I have these guidelines for like, okay, at this point of a story structure, and you already have your theme, then you know that in the beginning of the exposition, in the beginning of a sequence, you need to establish a sync beat. And to establish a sync beat, you need to properly instill distance and bounce. You need to have an understanding of the causer, which is what that means is simply understanding why the sequence is happening in the first place. So every sequence is happening because something causes it.
Right.
And that's all the causer means. So it's the bounce is just perpetuating what the audience thinks is the causer of the sequence, while the distance is hiding or concealing the real causer of the sequence. So I'm curious on how, like, from the way you were talking about it, it's very clear that to me this format could potentially be translated into choosing your alterology, because there's some kind of, like you're saying, story experience thrownness element to it that we've been talking about. So the problem that what I'm having a hard time with in like writing, so Alex and I, my writing partner, we're writing the screenwriting book that pertains to theme, but I'm personally writing the theme storyteller, the whole grand picture, which directly relates to this choice in alterology.
Right.
And I'm having a hard time translating the story structure, I mean, the storyteller language with this choice of the alterology. So the way you were talking about it before I started talking here was great, because it gave me the sensation that it's definitely translatable.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, well, for me, I think, we've talked about the meaning crisis, which, we can think of the meaning crisis as a lot to do with this problem of storytelling without the hyphen versus storytelling with hyphen. And we've also been talking about also thema and thema, theme and thema, and the question of alterology and different things. One of the ways that I guess I mentally kind of bridge some of these gaps, in addition to what we've already said, is I sometimes am quite critical. I think we need to, so I have a piece called The Meaning Crisis as a Sign of Hope, which tries to argue that we talk about the meaning crisis like it's a dead end that we kind of fell into. What are we going to do? When really the meaning crisis is more like we're Thomas More. We have higher standard. We know how to get meaning. Nationalism, racism, closed-mindedness. We could solve the meaning crisis right now. It's just that we have higher standards. We don't want to say go back into nationalism, right? So there's a sign of hope in the meaning crisis, right? And so we need to frame it as being self-imposed because we hold ourselves to a higher standard, right? And so the very fact that we have to choose an ontology now, that we have to have a chosen given, is a result of us holding ourselves up to a standard, which in of itself means that we're in this situation because we are collectively storytelling. We are realizing, as opposed to just storytelling without the hyphen. Like we are at the phase where we're saying, look, we're going to figure out how to storytell with the hyphen or we're going down. The king's going to have to execute us. We're going to figure it out or we're going down. So we are, even if we don't have the language, collectively not accepting because of our ethics, because the ethics collectively are greater than our ego, they're kind of calling something greater than ourselves and saying we are not going to fall into a collective storytelling without the hyphen because that's nationalism. That gives us meaning in a bad way, right? So there is something about we are submitting ourselves to a meaning crisis because we are looking for a way to storytell with a hyphen collectively, as opposed to just storytell collectively without the hyphen. Do you understand what I'm saying on that?
Absolutely. Yeah,
so the first key move that I think, if I were to put it in your language, I think we need to instead of calling it the meaning crisis, you need to think of it something more like the meaning story. So you had the story of meaning through history. And what it was is you had the rising action, the development of religions, the development of philosophies, and all these different things. So you had a rising action of philosophy, of like religion and givens. You had a rising action. And then you got to the inciting incident, the death of God. Or Nietzsche, or Nazi Germany, like this failure of givens, where you see that givens can actually be the banality of evil, and it can do these things, which then led to a crisis. The meaning crisis is a phase in the meaning story, and the crisis is today, where we realize, oh crap, storytelling without the hyphen can lead to to Nazism and all these terrible things, and God is dead. So now, what do you have to do in a climax? You have to make a choice. All climaxes entail a major choice. And that is the final absolute choice. That is the real choice. That is the ontological choice. And it is the choice to be willing to choose ontology. Like you have to choose to be willing to accept the very schema that we are putting forth, right? You have to choose to see that, of which then would have you choose your ontology, right? So there's a choice to connect them, like this. So the meaning crisis is the choice, the meaning climax of choosing ontology, which then if we can do that, you can have the resolution of the chosen given. So I think by rethinking the meaning crisis as the meaning story, and you had the rising action, the inciting incident, and now you have the climax of the ontological choice, which is the choice to move to storytelling with a hyphen collectively versus storytelling without the hyphen, then you see how that the work you do on storytelling and the questions of theme all fit collectively under a meaning story, as opposed to calling it the meaning crisis. By calling it the meaning crisis, you lose sight of the arc. You lose sight of the development of meaning. No, and you lose sight also, we know how to give ourselves meaning. When you call it a meaning crisis, you act like we don't know how to create meaning. We do know how to create meaning. We're just not allowing ourselves to do that. We're the hero. Darth Vader's like, join me, Luke. Like the villain is like, do it. And the crisis is that we are refusing that immorality. But Darth Vader's like, look, if you don't join me, you're going to have to figure out how to beat the empire without me. That's figuring out how to have a chosen given. That's figuring out ontology. That's figuring out how to choose ontology and to live with one another, which requires a development of storytellers with
the hyphen. And that, you know, so for me, the reframing of the meaning crisis as the meaning story can help bridge those things.
That was amazing. That was amazing. That really put it put it into perspective for me unbelievably. First, it's making me think Heidegger, you know, writes a history of the philosophy as nihilism, basically. To me, it's like we should write a project where it's like philosophy as the history of the meaning story.
Yeah,
like
it's a meaning story.
Literally the opposite in a sense.
Yes.
Like I think when Nishitani talks about nothingness, he is talking about the meaning story.
Yes.
And not like nihilism in that Heidegger sense that Heidegger's talking about nihilism.
Right.
Wow, I have a lot to think about now. I feel like
we must speak again. Your work is just tremendous, Andrew, and I've enjoyed this very much, Andrew. You are a delight.